I'm glad. I'm glad we're doing
There are a staggering 1.8 billion young people aged 15 to 24 in the world today. That's the largest youth population in human history. And while young people represent around 1/5 of the global population, they make up 1/3 of the total unemployed global workforce. Without work, young people are more prone to early pregnancy, early marriage, lack health care, and inherit the cycle of poverty from earlier generations. But if young people are able to achieve their full potential, the markets would see huge economic gains, resulting in an estimated increase in global GDP anywhere between 4.4 and 7%. The time is now to address youth unemployment and provide young people with better access to economic opportunities. Save the Children recognizes and celebrates that today's children are tomorrow's parents and leaders. That's why our programs focus on ensuring that children are able to successfully make a healthy transition to adulthood. Our goal is to equip girls and boys with the skills required to be successful, to link them to opportunities where they can earn decent income and achieve their goals, and to influence the systems to make training more relevant to the needs of both employers and young people. Our programs like Skills to Succeed, Youth in Action, and Youth Save empower youth with the knowledge, skills, and resources they need to succeed. One study we conducted in Bangladesh indicated that a year after graduating from one of our youth empowerment programs, participants found their monthly income increased approximately 4.5 times. Our approach is tailored to the unique needs of the deprived youth we serve. We take a positive youth development and a rights-based approach, and we're responsive to the specific needs of the labor markets where we work. Save the Children innovates through the creation of digital solutions for young people. For example, our mobile application, Do It, helps youth develop their financial capabilities.
Sebelum saya menggunakan aplikasi Duit, saya itu orangnya jujur saja nggak suka nabung, dan itu nggak terbiasa banget untuk menabung. Dan saya juga menyisihkan uang itu juga dari orang tua, kan nggak mungkin saya terus-terusan minta. Si aplikasi inilah yang mengingatkan saya untuk menabung.
We also launched a virtual reality application, Becca XR, to help youth visualize career pathways and develop employment skills. And we recently created a solution that uses geomapping to connect youth in slums to actual jobs. Children and youth are not just our future. They're the present. And Save the Children works to ensure that every child and every young person has the opportunity to achieve their full potential, no matter where they come from, who they are, or what they dream of becoming.
So I'd like to welcome everyone back from the break. We're going to get started with continuing our morning sessions. To begin, we're going to have our second session, which is on what matters for self-employment. Is it cash? And I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. We're then going to have a session entitled, Are We Robbing Prakash to Pay Priyanka? Which will talk about displacement and how it affects youth employment programs. And we'll end the morning with a session on the future of work. Is it a zombie apocalypse or a superhero adventure? So just some housekeeping up front. I believe we have more seats up in front, so if you need a seat, please come forward. Like the session before, we will ask you if you have questions of the presenters to put them on Post-it notes and raise them up for us, and we'll collect them as we go. Please keep in mind that we can't answer all of the questions in the panel, but we are going to use your questions later on for the white paper that we'll produce after this event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for session 2. To my immediate right is Dr. Nathan Fiala of the University of Connecticut, Dr. Nikita Sa of Save the Children. You already know our moderator, David Barth from Save the Children, Susana Puerto Gonzalez of the International Labor Organization, Dr. Louise Fox, Chief Economist of USAID, and Frederick Christopher of Save the Children Bangladesh. And so we'll get started with a presentation from Dr. Fiala.
All right, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to present these results. What I'm going to be presenting is results of a 9-year follow-up of a cash transfer program that we did in cooperation with the government of Uganda. So I'm not sure if we have, oh, there we go. This is with some colleagues of mine, Chris Blattman, who's at the University of Chicago, and Sebastian Martinez, who's at the IADB. So just really quickly to set the stage a little bit on what works for youth employment. So microfinance, I think a lot of us have some opinions on the impact of microfinance. It's got a mixed record. I think there's some good evidence that it's good at handling risks and shocks. However, if you have a strong opinion about whether or not microfinance has an impact on any kind of labor or income activities for people, I really strongly encourage you to see this paper that I have with a PhD student where we do a meta-analysis of some of the studies that are out there. We find that these studies are extremely low power. And so, in fact, there's really not much that we can really conclude about microfinance other than that it does not have huge transformative effect. There's also some TVET programs. There's been some work, evaluations on those, and I'll leave that to others to discuss. The results are not generally convincing, though as far as I am aware, few have actually looked at providing capital on top of this TVET training. And that's going to, I think, be the really key part of what we find here in these results, because this is, in the end, a TVET program that we evaluated, but with a strong top-up cash component. So this, there is some evidence on cash grants. Some of the early evidence was very promising, but there's very little evidence out there for unconditional cash transfers, or in this case, what I'll be presenting today, kind of a semi-conditional transfer to youth. So I'm going to be describing to you the Youth Opportunities Program. This is a program back in 2007 that the government streamlined into a large-scale community-driven development program in the north of the country. So groups of 15 to 30 youth applied for a cash transfer. They received money into a bank account all at once, and then that was divided up among the group participants, or the group purchased things together. But it came to about $400 per person. This is between a year to a year and a half's worth of income for a lot of this population, so it's a pretty significant amount of money to be handed overnight. Now, the conditions for the cash, though, was that they had to write a proposal saying that they would use the cash in order to get vocational training, buy tools, and any other startup costs for the businesses that they're going to start. Of course, once they received the money, there was no oversight by the government, so in this case, we call it a semi-conditional because there wasn't a follow-up to ensure that they were actually doing this, but it was conditioned upon the fact that these are groups applying for this money. And we had a last-minute opportunity to do a randomized controlled trial. So just a quick timeline, the government announced this program back in 2006. The program itself was coming to an end in 2008, and they had some funds remaining to fund 265 groups in 10 districts in the north of the country. So we said, well, you have tens of thousands of applications just sitting around. Why don't you approve 535 of those, and we can then do a randomized evaluation of the program, randomly selecting from those that have been approved to receive, whether or not they receive the program or not. So the government delivered the transfers in 2008. We did a 2-year and a 4-year follow-up in 2010, 2012. We find very large impacts, and I'll show you some of that in just a minute. And then we just completed a 9-year follow-up with the participants. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. So first off, to go back in time, when we met them after 2 years, our first question was, well, what did you do with this money that you received? And so what we found is they actually did invest it generally as they had planned to. We can't exactly back out all of the money because cash is fungible, but it looks like they spent at least 2/3 of it, of the cash that they received, on what it is that they had actually proposed to do. And so we've got, this is some bar graphs here with our treatment and control groups. So the treatment group is much more likely to receive some kind of training, although keep in mind the control group did receive some training also. These were these are young people that were very excited about starting businesses. So they did want this program, and so absent the program, a few of them were able to go out and find some way to fund some training. Those in the treatment group that received training had a lot more training than those in the control group that did, so the quantity of training and perhaps the quality of the training was also much higher in the treatment group. So this is great. This was some nice first evidence for us that people are actually making good use of this. However, let me just jump ahead and go ahead and, for the purposes of time, jump into some of our more interesting results on the impacts of income and welfare. And so this graph is a little bit misleading in one way, and I'll get to that in just a second. But basically what we're showing you here is the income of men and women over time as we follow them up at the baseline before the program, at the 2-year, at the 4-year, and then at the 9-year. And what's striking here is that at the 2-year, we see this very large difference between treatment and control men. So this is our treatment effect. And we see a modest but positive impact for women. That impact for women grew between the 2- and 4-year time period, and it actually shrank just a little bit for men. What's really interesting is that between the baseline and the 4-year follow-up, control group women have flat income. Absent this program, there was very little income opportunities for women in these areas. But of course, things changed a little bit when we came back after 9 years. Now, I'm not too surprised to see that there was convergence between the treatment and control men. So we saw, this big impact in the beginning. It was getting a little bit smaller over time. I'm not especially surprised that, it converged a little bit. Let me just note to you that it's, this control group is catching up, but also the treatment group is slowing down just a little bit. So we're, kind of extrapolating a few things with these linear lines here, but it does appear that there was, a slowdown in growth among the treatment men. However, for women, there was a huge growth among control women in their income. So, it took some time, but somewhere between the 4-year and the 9-year follow-up that we conducted, control women increased their income opportunities dramatically. And when I said that there's something a little bit misleading here, it does look like there's still a difference between treatment and control women at the 9-year point, but that's actually not true. Once we do this proper statistical analysis and we check on this, there's actually no difference. We cannot identify a difference between treatment and control women. So we had really big impacts in the beginning at the 2- and the 4-year mark, and then by 9 years, the impacts are gone. Now, that could be a really sad story for this program, and I think this is something we need to keep in mind when we're trying to do cost-benefit analysis and we assume lifetime earnings impacts. That may not actually be the case, so we need to be a little bit cautious about when we do those analysis. But let me actually present a little bit of good news here, and I'm sorry if this is not the easiest graph to immediately grasp. But this is looking at a cost-benefit analysis for the program. And so these two lines are, these two curves are with and without some kind of discounting. The green flat line is the cost of the program. That doesn't necessarily include all of the administrative costs. We aren't able to back out everything related to the administrative costs. But as a simple test of how close were the individual's earnings were to the cost of the program, it's at least a first rough approximation. And basically we found that under this scenario, the program was extremely effective, and basically the total amount of individual earnings was equal to the cost of the program by the 4-year mark. So everything that happened after the 4-year, and we assume a linear trend between the 4 and the 9-year, we don't know what was going on in between there, but everything that happened in between there is in addition to the cost of the program. This is actually a really important analysis to do for these types of programming. I think a lot of us are interested in cost-benefit analysis. I think a lot of us must be aware that finding that kind of cost effectiveness is really rare in programming. So the program was extremely effective, at least in the beginning, with increasing income. At the 9-year follow-up, though, we don't find any impacts on income, and a bunch of other outcomes that we looked at as well, including respondent health. We find no impacts there. We find really no impacts on child health, although there appears to be a little bit of impact for women. So the children of women that received the program, there may have been some small impact, but it was not very large, and very little, and no impact on child education. So just to get to some of the overall implications of the program, so it was once a very effective poverty intervention, but not so much in the long run. So again, it passed our cost-benefit analysis very easily by the 4-year mark, but of course, the results eventually disappear. The results that while we don't see any difference in treatment effects between men and women and the treatment and control for most of our outcomes, we do find it, for one thing, we do find some modest asset effects that stay around. All right, so those of you that are familiar with the Give Directly study, they did a longer-term follow-up, and they found basically similar results. So it's important also to note the catch-up by the treatment group, or sorry, by the control group, it's not just that the control group is doing better and is earning more income, but in fact that the treatment group is also slowing down a little bit. And so I think this is really important when we're thinking about the structural issues that exist in these economies. What is it that cash transfers can really do for people over the long term? Well, it may be there's a lot of things that are constraining people to make good use of them. However, we did find that cash transfers are initially, invested wisely by these young people. So there are, high rates of investment, but again, the structural issues may have been too much for them to be able to really take off. Of course, like all research, the location of the study was really specific and the context may matter. I think we'll get into some of that discussion, but this is a post-conflict area. It's northern Uganda. Their neighbors are really tough neighbors to have when it comes to conflicts. But also, we came in post-conflict, and so there's a lot of growth and takeoff in this part of the country. There's extreme growth in this area. I want to end with one note. There's a new paper out by Craig McIntosh and Andrew Zeitlin that I think is an absolutely fantastic paper, and I really love a lot of what they did there. They're calling this a benchmark where they compared a cash transfer program versus a USAID child malnutrition program. And they did this in Rwanda. So the results are a little bit complicated, but we can basically sum them up, I think, in 4 points. So first off, the USAID program improved some outcomes, but it didn't improve child health. Cash improved a couple of different outcomes, but was mostly used for assets and some buying down of debt. But a very large cash transfer, it was 4 times the cost of the USAID program or the smaller cash transfer, improved child health, but only modestly. And so I want to end with a quote from these authors that I think really summarizes my feelings about what cash transfers can do. So I'll just read this. Programs targeted towards driving specific outcomes can do so at a lower cost than cash. But large cash transfers drive substantial benefits across a wide range of impacts, including many of those targeted by the more tailored program. And so this, I think, encapsulates a lot of my feelings about when is cash appropriate. When you're trying to target specific problems, cash is not always the answer. There may be better programming that can really target that very well. However, when you're trying to address broader, bigger problems that people may be facing, cash may be a really nice way to address those issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Got it. Great. Thank you, Nathan. And well, you've been introduced to the panel. As we did earlier, what we'd like to do is engage all of you. So I'd love you all to start thinking through questions you may have on anything that came up during Nathan's presentation, but also on thinking through where our gaps are in terms of research you'd like to see, particularly around the issues of self-employment versus wage employment, and the kind of skills plus supplement that you feel is missing as you try to translate research into action. Let me ask and as you're writing out your questions, if you can say to whom you'd like to direct it, that would be really helpful too. So let's start with you, Nick, if I may. You've worked with Youth in Action, and that work has shown the impact of a positive proximal environment for skills training. So maybe you could talk us through a little bit about the effect of the proximal environment on both the larger outcome of youth self-employment and employment generally?
Sure.
Yeah.
So what I'm struck by through Nathan's presentation, through the opening keynote speech, and through the last panel is the struggle about mechanisms of change, right? Where we have these broader impacts that we're seeing, but the question that underlies all of this is about what is the mechanism, what's actually changing, how is it changing, who is it changing for, who is it not changing for? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we did in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation in Burkina Faso, Malawi, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Egypt. And this project was specifically for youth between about 14 to 18 in extremely rural areas of these 5 countries, and for youth who'd previously been out of school or had never been to school. About a third of the youth in our sample had never been to school before. And so a lot of the work that we did was skills training. Functional literacy, functional numeracy, financial literacy, skills training, business skills. And then youth were given a small cash stipend between about $90 to about $200, depending on the country, to either invest in their own business, a small micro enterprise, find some employment and use that money to find employment, return to school if they chose to do so, or go to a technical vocational training program or an apprenticeship program. And overwhelmingly, about 90% of the youth across the 5 countries chose self-employment, chose to start a micro enterprise. One is because they got the money directly, and money is king. And so the youth like to have control over that money. But 2, in a lot of these contexts where we were working, the youth didn't really have access to other resources, employment in their communities, technical or vocational training programs. And so self-employment or micro-enterprise became a really important piece of work or pathway that the youth could work within. And so we did a lot of operations and qualitative research early on in the program to figure out, what did this actually mean? How were youth using these skills, and what did it mean for their self-employment? And one of the key pieces that we found was about the proximal enabling environment, the families and communities right around the youth, and how that affected how youth used their skills and how they could translate those skills into livelihood opportunities. So a discourse analysis that we did really early on, we found that family members, especially in Malawi, Burkina Faso, and Uganda, viewed youth as being lazy and not hardworking, quite like how my parents found me several years ago.
Familiar, so.
But that was important because family members and community members were gatekeepers for these young adolescents, for these youth. They were gatekeepers to youth being able to start a job or start their own business, grow it, diversify. And so it was really important for us to figure out how to engage families and communities. And this was especially important because youth were in this constant process of trying to negotiate a reputation in their community and amongst their families for being hardworking. And subsequent research that we did, we saw 3 main things that youth were trying to do, 3 main ways. One was they were trying to demonstrate to families and communities that they were using their free time in a really appropriate way, in a socially appropriate manner. The second thing that they were trying to do was demonstrate perseverance. Families and community members really wanted to see that youth could persevere through any kind of challenge they had. And that made families and community members more likely to invest in businesses for youth. And the third thing was actually attending these kind of small training programs like Youth in Action, like we had, was seen as a signal in the community that youth were dedicated. And that's really important for us because we use that mechanism, the signaling mechanism. I know there are lots of economics people in this room. We didn't do a traditional signaling test, but one thing that we found was that as we worked more with families and communities, they started also investing a lot more in youth. Maybe not in terms of money, but definitely in terms of material support. So things like making room in the courtyard so they could start a small business there. Also in terms of emotional support, giving them advice, supporting them in the business decisions. And almost 2 years after youth graduated from the program, we also found these effects in terms of mentorship from community members. Youth was still saying that they had mentors in the community who were helping them with their business. So this was important because of the signaling effect, but also because programs like Youth in Action, what we found, can meet an equity gap for some of these youth. So if you think of family and community support as an equity issue, there are some youth who have very limited family and community support and others who have a lot. Programs like Youth in Action and other training programs can actually meet an equity gap for youth who are trying to build these self-employment skills and start their own business by helping them build more skills. What we found was that the youth that benefited the most from the skills training were the youth that had the most limited family and community support. And so that is a critical mechanism when we're thinking about working with young youth, with adolescents really, in extremely rural areas in continental Africa or in these 5 countries. And I think that's something that we want to tease out more in the future work that we do about how do we work within the proximal enabling environment to effectively support youth self-employment and livelihood development.
Thanks. Can I ask a super quick follow-up, which is, you said 90% of kids chose self-employment. And how much of that was really a choice versus that's the only thing available? And should we be rethinking that from the position that between the 4th Industrial Revolution and automation, informality, the decline of social safety nets, that wage work, it may just not be available.
Yeah. So I use the word chose very lightly, but it is true because when we first did a needs assessment and all of that, we actually looked at all of the 5 different pathways: employment, self-employment, apprenticeship, technical vocation, and we found that there were possible avenues. But as we actually started rolling out the program, the information that we got back from community mobilizers, from youth, was that employment wasn't a real pathway for these youth. It was really hard for the younger youth, these were youth between 14 to 18, first of all, to break into the employment sector, to find formal employment, to be able to leave their home and travel 3 or 4 hours to a technical or vocational education school. It's very hard for them. And so self-employment was a choice, but was also the best option for these youth in those communities.
So Susanna, you've thought a lot about labor markets. Oh, I'm sorry. You've thought a lot about labor markets. How do you react to the sort of self-employment, wage employment dichotomy, and are there lessons from these studies that you think are applicable to wage employment?
Well, speaking of transferability of lessons, it's a little bit hard because when you think about interventions that are designed to address or to boost sustainable self-employment vis-a-vis interventions that are aiming at creating wage employment. And so you are not only speaking about different programs and models of intervention, you are also speaking about a different target group, no? So the YOP it was particular about a post-conflict setup. You are mentioning a context where there is limited private sector investment. There are probably there's no private sector hiring or absorbing the youth labor force locally. So I will not really speak too much about what's transferable in terms of the lessons coming from YOP. However, I will say when we speak about wage employment, there are different stakeholders as well, no? So we speak about the private sector, we speak about employers, and you mentioned apprenticeships. So these are mechanisms that bring new actors on board. There might be different ways of addressing wage employment. There are supply-side interventions, there are demand-side interventions. So if we look, for example, at the supply-side interventions, then we can create some parallel to the skills training components of the YOP or other types of interventions, where it is evident that multi-pronged interventions like multiple services do really make seem to work. Like they do really make a change in improving the labor market outcomes of youth. So we've a couple of for some time we work on a systematic review of youth employment interventions with a colleague over there. And this was one of the key results of studying over 100 impact evaluations between 1990 to 2014. Creating this bundle of services, it creates a positive boost in labor market outcomes of young people, from probability of employment to earnings, etc. So there are some parallels that we can create between interventions or the design of interventions to boost self-employment vis-a-vis wage employment. When we think about other types of programs to create wage employment, like wage subsidies or public works programs, then let's say the evidence is not as rich as we see the evidence growing much more in the field of self-employment or entrepreneurship. But we also see that it's quite important to work with those actors, with employers, mostly employers, so that they are able to take up on these types of interventions and create opportunities, let's say an exposure for young people that is meaningful, that it goes beyond a week of training or a week or 2 weeks of or some life skills training, but rather it's a work-based learning experience that it goes over 6 months and it's able to create important changes in attitudes and skills, in knowledge and behaviors of young people. And there is a lot more to say there, but I'll pass it on now to Luis.
I think one of the important points is we know that the full bundle is a powerful thing. The question is, what does it mean to have 70% of the bundle or 50% of the bundle or 40% of the bundle? It's a very hard to, the data set is so incomplete that certainly, we all agree a 6-week training program is not sufficient, but then at what point do you cross over the line to sufficient? Let me ask Frederick a question. So you heard what Nathan was saying earlier, that YOP was a kickstart, and you could see it in the data, but that over time it really didn't lift people out of poverty at a rate any higher than lack of intervention. How does that impact or reflect on the work you're doing in Bangladesh as a programmer?
Let me start with a quote that entrepreneurs are not only born, but can also be trained and developed. I do agree with Dr. Nathan. What he said is this youth opportunities program serves as a kickstart, but doesn't move people out of poverty. I think as an implementer angle, I would say that this is just a beginning, but it doesn't really end poverty or move people out of poverty. What we found from many of the programs which we have implemented in Bangladesh and previously in other countries where I worked, cash is not the only solution. We have really experienced from the lessons learned that cash alone is not going to help youth to come out of poverty or to raise their income level. There are so many aspects. What we found is by giving them cash, definitely they have access to capital. But again, what kind of capital? Is it for equipment or for working capital? So this is again needs to be classified. The second area what we found is business identification becomes a very significant part of the youth. Just giving them cash and asking them to do doesn't help them at all. So we found that before we give them cash, there are certain things which we need to do. One is pre-preparation, that is preparing the youth for the future by giving them achievement motivation training, how to run their business, how to handle cash, and how can they multiply cash 7 times, 8 times, or 3 times over a course of period. So we learned many lessons out of that, and then we started implementing the programs one after the other, improving. And one of the very great barriers in youth empowerment is access to markets. They start something which they like, but as an implementer, as a program developer, we failed because we wanted to distribute the cash as much as possible, as quick as possible, so that we can clean our records. But the struggling beneficiaries are the youth. So we found that they need something prior to cash disbursement, and also after disbursement, they also need follow-up. Monitoring is something, a very big backbone of the success. Cash alone is not able to survive this youth beneficiaries, but we found that they need constant monitoring, follow-up, and also a business mentor for them to walk along with them so that they can also advise them, help them, and then link them to the markets and then develop the markets and so on. The other area which we found is giving them cash plus alone is not going to work, but also strengthening the local systems, the value chain and the supply chain. That also enabled them to really move out of poverty.
Thank you. So, Luis, let me ask you, you're the chief economist at USAID, the world's largest bilateral development agency. And so when you hear, I think I'm more than curious to hear your recommendations about about the practicality of extracting good program design from the kinds of recommendations you're hearing here and bridging those two often separate areas.
Okay. Well, I also was pleased to hear the shout out for the USAID finance study. And I do think at USAID we're thinking about the role of cash versus the role of the other things. I don't think we will, however, become an agency that's heavily cash-based for all of the reasons I think you've heard. I think what I'm trying to discuss with my USAID colleagues is we need to ask ourselves, is the problem the individual or is the problem the environment? And I think it's easy in a situation where between 1/3 and 1/2 of the working age population is between the ages of 15 and 30 to say, oh my God, we have a youth employment problem. My good friend Zafira Zanato wrote a paper called for the Middle East called "Youth Need Jobs and So Do Their Parents." I think in most countries what we have is an employment problem, and there may be very few aspects of it that are youth specific. And so what I try to argue is we need diagnosis before we do prescription, and we need to understand what are the employment issues in the country, what are the opportunities, and we need to spend more time thinking about how to expand those opportunities for everyone. So I'm not doubting there are youth-specific issues, and I think some others on the panel have, articulated them, but they are really a small fraction of the whole problem. And so, for example, I think that what we can learn from the NUSEF example is that in a post-conflict situation where the economy was kind of almost destroyed by conflict and was just getting back on its feet, we're not sure where the opportunities are going to come from. We're not sure how fast they're going to develop. And so might be a good idea to try cash. And I think it was a good idea, and I think we've learned a lot from that program. Would that program have worked in downtown Kampala? I'm not so sure. And so I think we also need to perhaps think about how to fix the environment. I would give a shout out to WeGo, a group that's been doing a lot of work on how to raise earnings of everyone in the informal sector. It focuses on women, but it's primarily about how to raise everyone's earnings, how to get an environment in which work is safer, and which you can make more money, and which your earnings aren't taken up by harassment and corruption by the local authorities. Now, that's not a youth-specific problem, but it may be a problem that youth are facing, and it may be way more important than some of the youth-specific obstacles we may identify.
Thank you. Crystal, you want to read them, or should we? Let's see, I don't know if I have my reading glasses here. Okay. To what extent is selection criteria important for grant beneficiaries, particularly if directed for self-employment? Selection criteria.
I think it's a really great question. And I think that's really important in the context of something like YOP. So I can't stress enough that these are groups of young people that came together and wrote a proposal. And so that means something. They spent time and a lot of effort coming together first, and then to actually write down something. And so, of course, these aren't the poorest, on average, people in the communities, because quite a few of them need to be able to read and write in order to write up a proposal. And on top of that, about half of the groups actually were interacting already before, and the other half kind of formed in various ways afterwards. But the common thing across all of them was they were very excited about starting a small business. It's in the context of a community-driven development program. So the community could pick out what program they wanted. These are just communities that happened to pick out a cash transfer program. Highly selected in this. I think the process of sitting down and writing out a proposal as a group was a big part of the success of this program. I can't prove that. We don't have any evidence about giving cash to individuals, so we can make a proper comparison. But I think there was some kind of solidarity that kind of formed through these groups and excitement about the process. These are not the average Ugandans. And I certainly wouldn't want to go into Kampala and do cash transfers with the average person in Kampala for one other very specific reason, which is that these are people that don't have any income generating activities at the moment. And so I think this is important to separate in the literature between programs that are designed to expand existing businesses versus programs that are trying to create new businesses. All right, and to get to another point as well, nobody wants to start their own business. They all want wage labor. Everyone I talk to in Uganda wants a job. All right, this is just what they have to do. when you have no other income opportunities, this is a really great way to generate some income opportunities. Once you've started a business, I think the evidence, I have research on this, but there's lots of other work on it. It's really hard to grow an existing business. So there's lots of things that's very specific about this sample.
Yeah, and certainly in the United States, if you fail in your first business attempt, it doesn't preclude you from a second. But in much of the rest of the world, that's not the case, or at least you're going to be facing more scrutiny from parents and peers and community in a bad way. So the next question is about the secret of sustainability. So if one of you can solve that, that would be fantastic. Sustainable self-employment is difficult for young people. How do they keep on making progress?
Address that. Let me just say that sustainable self-employment is difficult for everyone. It's not a youth-specific problem. And I think, so I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the next session, but we need to understand what's the context. Low-income countries are poor because they don't have a lot of firms, big firms, offering wage employment, and that the economy is underdeveloped, so it's really difficult to sustain a business, even a small business, even a business employing 5 to 15 workers. You know, self-employment is easy entrance. It's easy to enter, and that means it's easy to get competition and to get outcompeted. And so this should not be a surprise that people eventually get outcompeted, abandon their business, try again. Maybe they didn't have access to land, so they started as self-employment if they're in rural areas. Then they get access to land through their families. People get older, they get access to land, whatever. They go back and forth between those sectors. They find another opportunity. So I think we need to, it's almost like people's economic histories in income earning activities will not be like they were in the US in the 1950s. You go, you leave school, you get a job, you stay there for 40 years, you get a gold watch, you retire. Just not going to be. And it's not exactly what we should try for, we should expect. So I think that Nathan had it just about right when he talked about these kind of programs as giving youth a boost into something, which may or may not succeed, you know, but we're accelerating the progress toward finding a livelihood.
I can add a little bit on that. We did an impact evaluation of an ILO intervention for women entrepreneurs and business owners in Kenya. And one of the lessons learned from the evaluation is that training helps to improve some practices that in the long term we had a series of different measures. So let's say 4 years after the intervention, we could see that those practices help the women to keep better inventories, better stocks, to maintain, to come earlier to the markets. So some practices that speak a lot about the behaviors of the individuals that it's is helping to boost, let's say, well, it's not super long-term sustainability, but it's giving some stability to the women that receive the training.
Thank you. So Nathan, you've stimulated a fair amount of thinking. Just following along with those last two comments and our last question here. I think this was answered in your presentation, so maybe you can expand it. The question is, did you examine the children of both the controls and the recipients, and if so, any impact on them? You did. We saw that there, and there wasn't significant impact. But I'd be interested to know, which unanticipated consequences, positive and negative, are you able to look at in a proper evaluation? And how sort of dispositive is that data? Because my first thought when I saw those things spreading, I was like, well, at least they're 5 years in, they're 24, 25, 26. They might be starting family formation. So even if wages flatten out, there may be some advantage to the child, but that didn't bear out.
Yeah, this is actually one of the most disappointing things from the project, from the research for me. And for my co-authors as well. If you follow early childhood development programs, there's supposed to be a time period where these things really can have big impacts. And certainly the positive impacts that we found were happening at the time when a lot of women were pregnant and giving birth to kids and having very young kids throughout this time period. And so while I'm not too surprised that the results kind of disappeared after 9 years, I am surprised that there weren't some kind of lasting impacts for the young kids in the household. I think one reason could be that we just didn't measure it very well. We had a limited budget, and so our donor was able to only give us enough money to ask the parents about their kids and ask a man in Uganda about his children, and you're going to get some very noisy data, let's say that. We see a little bit of impacts, a little bit of movement with women, but again, we don't have the actual measures of the kids themselves, and I think that would have been something that could have been improved dramatically here. But of course, if I had infinite money, then I'd be able to do all the type of research that I want, or none of it. I don't know.
But you feel like it's inconclusive, or?
I would say that it's a bit inconclusive. I don't want to make strong statements around that. I think people can make comments on their own health really well, and I think most women can make comments about their child's health fairly accurately. But we have some standard off-the-shelf measures that we used that were asked of the parents, not of the kids. So we cannot be completely confident in that measure. However, that said, I see very few early life interventions that show long-run impacts through RCTs. And I think that that's a gap in the research. Not saying that's necessarily a gap in the programming. I think that may just be a very difficult thing to connect with research.
Well, thank you. I want to open it up for any last comments if anyone wants to capstone, which I think has been a pretty nutritious sort of.
Just wanted to share with you that the trend is changing, and if I can talk about Bangladesh, Save the Children Bangladesh, we are implementing a program called Education for Youth Empowerment. Our target is about 180,000 youth per year. And if you look at the trend for the past 3-4 years, 90% of the targets, they want work jobs, but 10% they want to look into self-employment. And then if you look at 10% within our targets, that is huge. Then look at the whole population of Bangladesh. So there is immense increase among the youth to go for self-employment. And I think the country is also now moving on into a middle income country. Now, you can see that a lot of trends are happening, that there is a great opportunity for programmers like us, organizations like us, to really fix saying that instead of the women going to the ready-made garments building, can that be subcontracted? So that the women can do the work at their home itself, take care of the child, feed the child, as well as do the garments at home at piece rate basis. So we are looking at a different way approach to see how these small enterprises, micro enterprises can be strengthened and created.
Well, I hope you guys appreciated that as much as I do. We can give a round of applause to the panelists. So you guys have already heard a bit from Dr. Louise Fox. It's a little awkward to do the introduction after you've been on the panel, but we're gonna do that anyways. As I mentioned, Dr. Fox is the chief economist at USAID. I spent 20 years at USAID, and in my time there, the role of the economist sort of waxed and waned. It's an agency that's undergoing some really important transformation. It's not just a reorganization in terms of boxes on a organogram, but really restructuring how an institution that large thinks about resilience, thinks about sustainability, thinks about our country partners and how we map them to a better and a stronger future. And so the fact that you're here, and I know your fingerprints are on this reorganization, although from behind, and you've got a generation of economists that you're keeping on the cutting edge is an enormously important thing for U.S. foreign assistance and for certainly for our partnership. So glad you're here.
well, I will say that I do indeed have an interesting job in interesting times. But I am pleased to be part of the change at USAID. And when I was hired, I said to them, well, you know, I'm not really a macroeconomist because my two predecessors have been macroeconomists. They were also named Steve, so I offered to change my name to Stevie, but fortunately that wasn't required. But I said, I'm not a macroeconomist, and they said, we know that. I said, I'm a labor economist. They said, we know that, and we want you to come and help us do better on our work on employment. So that's been indeed one of the things that I have been working on. And I'm going to share some of that knowledge with you today, and it's also based on about 15 years of working in this area or more in low-income countries. Okay, so there we are. Are we robbing? I love the titles of the session. You know, you guys are great. I had a very boring title for my paper, and then this one came up. It's great. So I guess I want to build on Professor Banerjee's comment about displacement, and that nobody's really thinking about the question, not of who got the job, but who didn't get the job. And so I want to talk about the question of whether what do we know about whether youth-targeted interventions create new jobs or just redistribute the existing jobs among youth or among youth and non-youth adults. Now, economists call this question the general equilibrium problem, meaning what are the indirect effects of the intervention? And I think that we often fail to realize is that while randomized controlled trials, everybody knows what an RCT is by now, I think, is definitely the gold standard because we got a treatment control, we're handling selectivity, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't ask the general equilibrium problem. It almost never asks who else was affected. And I think we can do that in the context of RCTs. We can do that in the context of other kinds of impact evaluations. And we need to do that if we're really going to understand what's the impact of what they're doing. And we need, so I'm going to present, first of all, two quick economic frameworks. First of all, this is ILO data that shows you how the employment transformation progresses as an economy gets rich. What you notice about this slide is that in low-income countries where the most vulnerable children in the world live, most of the jobs are not wage jobs. They are either in non-farm self-employment or farming. And if we're doing a program that is trying to help people grab one of those very few number of wage jobs, we've left out most of the poorer and vulnerable people, youth or non-youth. We've ignored them. We have targeted, we may have even a regressive program because we've really targeted our program at the richest. If you can get a steady wage employment in an urban area, you are definitely not poor in a low-income country. So, and if you notice, that really doesn't change until you get to be an upper middle income country. Why is that? It's very simple. If you think about the most primitive economy, it's everybody producing everything they need at home. And economic development is about changing that. More firms, more specialized activity. Specialized activity gives people higher earnings because they specialize in what they can do. They tend to work with more capital. So as the economy creates more formal firms, it creates more wage jobs and more opportunities, and that's called economic development. And if you're in Bangladesh today, you can wish that you had the labor market of the US. You can wish that, but you don't. And you need to work with the opportunities that you have and will have and try to make them better paying, people earning more, lower risk, less fluctuation. And this is not mostly a youth-specific problem, as I mentioned in the previous session. It's a development problem. Okay, now, sorry, you're going to get just a little bit of economics here. The classic labor market problem that you learned if you took a basic economic course is there's supply of labor and there's demand for labor, and the intersection gives you the wage rate and the employment. And everybody who wants to work at a higher wage rate than that won't get a job because the firms won't hire you. And there are lots of assumptions underlying this, you know, everybody's the same and whatever. We can suspect that everybody's about the same at an entry-level wage job, or you can draw these for different labor markets. But the real important thing is that if the supply is increasing faster than the demand, and that's shown by that green curve line out there, basically, unless the wage falls, you get a lot more people unemployed. And in many cases, the wage doesn't fall, especially the entry-level wage. So you just get a lot more people unemployed. And the only way you can keep employment up at that wage is if the demand curve moves out along with the supply of labor. All right, so what's the second one? I labeled the developing country labor market. All right, well, this has a little different supply curve. You see a flat portion and then an upward portion. Why do you see a flat portion? Well, this reflects the reality of an entry-level market, probably in the US as well as in a developing country, that there's a wage which below that people won't work. That may be a minimum wage, so you can't work below that, at least not in a formal wage economy. But it could be just the cost of getting to work. I mean, think about how much it costs to get you here today. You took some public transportation, you had a breakfast, you got dressed probably in some expensive clothes, you left your probably expensive housing, and if you don't get paid enough to pay for all of that, it doesn't pay for you to go to work. So we don't have to have a big distortion to have that flat portion. So if the demand curve for labor is hitting that flat portion, that means the firm is going to hire everybody up to the limit in Group A. And they're not going to hire the people in Group B who are also willing to work at that wage and probably able to work at that wage. They're not going to be hired. And the employer's probably indifferent between A and B because those people are about the same to them. They're all kind of entry-level people without a lot of experience. All right? Now, what happens if I do a youth training program? Okay, I might expand the supply curve to the green one. So what I've done is I've said to the employer, now I've got a lot more people that look the same as the people you've already been hiring. Why don't you hire these people? The employer says, well, okay, especially if you give me a subsidy for it, but then I'm going to hire less of A. So now the people who can't qualify but can't work are B and C. And I've basically moved some of the people from B and C into A, and some of the people from Group A back out to B and C. So that's what we call displacement. That means we've just substituted one group of people for another group of people. We have not moved that demand curve out at all. And so we're very happy. Our RCT showed our people got jobs. But we didn't pay any attention to who didn't get a job, to the people who were in A and now are in Group B and C. Now, how do you know that you should do something on the supply side, and how do you know you shouldn't? How do you, is there any kind of rule of thumb to figure out where the demand curve is relative to that supply curve? Well, one thing is, if you're on the sloping portion of the supply curve, the wages are going up. If the wages are going up, and there are a lot of vacancies, then that group is in short supply. And maybe there's an argument for training. So that's the argument, for example, for a lot of ICT training. There may be other areas where it's important to do that kind of training. But overall, we need to spend a lot more time worrying about displacement. So my argument is, we need to think about, when we're designing an intervention, what are our key assumptions? What's our theory of change? And I can't tell you how many interventions I've seen. So all USAID project documents require a theory of change. You probably all know that because you've applied to be a contractor on USAID project documents. And other donors as well. Everybody wants a theory of change. But rarely are the assumptions actually spelled out. And for those of you who are in the business of doing skill training, let me just remind you that your theory of change is you need to improve youth characteristics. Your theory of change is there are a lot of jobs out there and they're not being filled. And you need to verify that assumption. Otherwise, you're probably just displacing one worker for another. And, you know, it's not good enough to go to a firm and say, what are your problems hiring? Because they'll say, oh yeah, we have some vacancies we can't fill. Guess what those vacancies are? Experienced engineer to fix our machines, experienced accountant, experienced human resource specialist, experienced lawyer. You get the message? The first word is usually experienced, and we're in a young country, so most of the labor force is not experienced, right? And the second word is like what they call a level 4 skill, a highly trained, specialized skill, not the skill that someone who just graduated from secondary school, especially in a low-income country where the methods of teaching may be poor, so they may not have learned much, not the things that they have, okay? So you need to be very carefully work with businesses and find out, is there a real problem? Now, on the other hand, maybe you should work on the demand side. And that we call the business climate. And there we think we can increase demand for youth labor, factors out of control of youth. And then, and our assumption there is that barriers to firm entry and growth are what is constraining the expansion of wage jobs. And maybe we should work there. Now, it gets a little complicated when you talk about self-employment because there are supply-side elements and demand-side elements, and it may be the characteristics of youth. But as I said before, it may be the characteristics of the environment. Okay, so I just want to run through some quick evidence on displacement that we have. We don't have very much evidence, as I said, from impact evaluations. But we have several studies that I've cited. First of all, a very famous one was done in France, where they did these job centers, and they helped get youth ready for employment and taught them how to fill out an application and look for a job. And the more they did it, the more youth affected in a particular area, the worse the outcomes were. Why? Well, because those, when they only did 10% of the youth, those youth were displacing the rest. So they clearly showed that they had displacement. They did it by varying the intensity of the effect. Another way they did it in Uganda, they randomized the firms that got the people who were apprentices or vocational training grads. And there they found that the apprentices or vocational training grads, they earned more money relative to the control group, but the firms did not expand hiring. The firms were happy for someone else to do the training, and they were even willing to pay them more, i.e. they were willing to pay for the training. But they didn't expand hiring, complete displacement. Okay, and then in Bangladesh, there was an interesting study about giving people in rural areas bus fare to go to urban areas and look for jobs in the off-season. Now, we don't know the general equilibrium of those subsidies. The investigator, Mubarak and his colleagues from Yale, did look at the general equilibrium effects within the village. And when some of the labor left in the off-season, left to the urban areas, the rural labor that remained, they raised their income. So you think, hey, that's great, win-win. People went to urban areas, people stayed in rural areas, win-win. Professor Mubarak told me that right after he released those results, a funder came to him and said, okay, let's scale up, let's do it all over Bangladesh. He said, whoa, wait a minute. Do you really think wages would stay the same in urban areas if we started flooding them with rural men in the off-season? Do you really think there'd be no general equilibrium effects? So now he's doing another experiment to try to measure them. In self-employment, this one is Uganda. This is Chris Blattman, the WINGS program, and he trained the women, and indeed, the women outcompeted the men, and some men went out of business. Complete redistribution. Maybe we think that was good. Maybe we think giving women a chance was good. Maybe we're happy with that project because it redistributed opportunities? I don't know, but you need to know it wasn't employment, it was redistribution. And then in Kenya, this is the one that Susanna referred to. Now there, they didn't find a displacement effect. So this was training for existing businesses, and those businesses grew, so they didn't, and the businesses that were there didn't grow. So we have mixed evidence on displacement. Thank you very much. Sure.
So now we're going to switch it up a bit. We're going to pass around some mics so you can actually speak up for once. But we would really love for you to still write some of your questions down so we can collect them for the white paper. But please raise your hand, the mic will come to you, and you can ask some questions directly to Luis. Luis, is it okay if I take two or three questions?
Take, 3, 4, as many as you feel before we get too long.
Okay. Let's start with 3 questions. I can't see very well, but
I have a mic here, yeah.
there's, yes. Lisa, sorry. I
So on the
couldn't see.
previous session, on the cash and all that, I didn't hear any discussion about life and employability skills and whether it's valued or not, or it's important, and I wanted to know why not.
Okay. Please also state your name and where you're from. Maybe you can do that as we pass the mic. Let's take
Jack
3
Boyson,
questions.
International School to work, school transition specialist.
Thank you. Yeah, let's take 3 questions.
Yes, hi. My name is Shelby French. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for Youth at Child Fund International. And my question had to do with some programming that we're doing that has 2 pathways of employment as well as self-employment. And we're looking at how youth who are taking the entrepreneurial track are providing wage activities for the youth who are on the other track. And I'm just wondering, in regards to displacement, if there's been any sort of attention paid to that sort of intervention.
Another question? Okay, pass to Jamie.
Jamie McAuliffe with the Aspen Institute. Louise, I'd love to, one of the things we're going to be doing this afternoon is talking about what is the future evaluation agenda. What should be the top research questions that should really influence the direction of the whole field? And I'm curious to hear what your 1 or 2 priority research questions are that you think would advance the overall evidence base for youth employment or other programming.
Maybe, do you want to start with those 3 questions, and you can pass the mic down there?
I apologize. I'm not sure I quite understand the intervention well enough to answer the second question. Maybe we can take it in the break or at lunch, and let me try to link the first and the third. So I looked at some reviews on soft skills. First of all, the evidence on soft skills is very confusing, because the interventions range from a year to 2 weeks. And we don't even, and most people don't even test to see if they had any outcome. They don't test them beginning and end. So we don't even know the first question, proof of concept, whether anybody actually got any skills. And the second thing is, so we don't have good evidence on that, but I looked at some of the evidence on that. Most of the programs that try to teach these so-called non-cognitive skills, the Big 5, grit, all that kind of stuff, they actually don't measure employment as an outcome. They measure mental health. They measure reproductive health. They measure a lot of other things, but not employment. And so going back to your question, here's the way I think about it. I think but this is a hypothesis, okay? This is not, and this is a research question. I think we've made a major mistake by focusing on employment only as an outcome and saying, okay, if youth need employment, then they need industry-specific or occupation-specific skills. Youth is a time of transition from dependence to independence in a number of different spheres. When the World Bank did their World Development Report, they had 4 spheres. There may be, some people think there's 5 spheres. But anyway, they have to do with moving from becoming a child to becoming a parent, forming a family, becoming an adult in the community, and participating in the community, as well as economic independence. So it's a number of different spheres. It's about agency. We always talk about agency. And I think it's probably been a mistake to separate out these different realms and say, reproductive health. Okay, we focus on that information. Employment. Let's give them vocational and technical education. And especially because vocational technical education is about 3 to 6 times as expensive as general secondary. And if we did a better job in general secondary, teaching both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, what they call the foundational skills, we might not need to teach the other. And so we've gone a very expensive route, which may not have been the right route. So I think we need to experiment a lot more. First of all, I would like, this is the discussion I'm having with my own agency, education bureaucracies are really hard to change, but is there something we can do at the secondary school level to introduce people to what the world of work is about? I once went to a country and I asked them, a food processor, some food processors in the business of that. I said, do you hire people from the vocational school? Well, sometimes. The vocational school is like 6 or 7 months long. Yeah, okay, what skills do you get from there? They said, well, mostly we have a higher retention rate because they know what a factory is. Okay, we could introduce people to the idea of a factory and how it works in less than 6 to 7 months, okay? If that's what's needed, that's a quick intervention. Maybe it's an after-school intervention, maybe it's a school field trip, maybe it's like 2 weeks, I don't know what it is, but, let's find out. And let's do that because employers themselves train the skills that they need that are industry and factory specific. So I think those are my top research questions, is how do all of the things youth need to learn to become independent, including tacit skills and networks that they need to build, et cetera, how do all those interact in the various realms that youth operate in?
Thank you. We have a question from the table here.
I'm Sherry from FHI 360. Are there any instances where displacement can have a positive kind of economic impact in terms of reducing turnover? There are parts of the world where women exit the labor markets quite predictably. So is displacement with a younger, more long-term employee a better investment? Is there a higher productivity that you can get out of a certain age group versus an older age group? Not to put too many generalizations out there, but I'm wondering if in your research there were any instances where displacement actually did have a positive impact.
So the main issue might be if you have redistribution assumptions. Then if you put a positive value on somebody being employed versus somebody else, or somebody earning versus somebody else, then it can have a positive impact. But, we don't have, okay, so first of all, let's let employers figure it out. There is a lot of age discrimination in the US against older employees, and people think that's wrong. And then other times, people think there's age discrimination against youth, and people think that's wrong. And there's discrimination in general when it's not based on, information is probably wrong. But I think the simple answer is really no. Let's let firms figure out. And firms do train people, okay? So they will train their entry-level employees. They're happy to have someone else do it for them. But if we want to subsidize firms, let's ask what's the best way to subsidize labor-intensive firms starting up and staying in business? Let's ask that question. I have some comments in my paper about how to do that, but let's ask that question and not say, oh, firm, you're coming in. Would you like some trained workers? Maybe, maybe not.
Okay, let's take 2 last questions. Susanna and Shaida. Perfect. But can I get mics up here?
Thank you. Luis, today we refer in very simplistic terms to the formal economy or informal economy, someone mentioned it. And I remember some time ago you mentioned something like the informal economy or informal is normal until the structural transformation kicks in. And I think that's super valuable, but I think there are a lot of research that is needed to explain how formalization is a means towards something else, right? So what are research opportunities that we can exploit to open knowledge and understanding in that spectrum?
Should we take another question and then we can close?
I am Shahida. I am from Bangladesh. I am working in Save the Children Bangladesh country office and leading youth empowerment program. So this photo says that the youth in Bangladesh, they are willing to start their self-employment after the vocational skills training, but they do not have access to the financial resources. Because according to Bangladesh laws, they are below 18 years, particularly age between 15 to 18 years, they do not have access. So how do you have any evidence or research how cash transfer can support self-employment for the female youth or the youth who are deprived in any countries?
So first of all, I'd say fix the laws and give them access, because it's never too early to start saving and banking. But yeah, I think, by the way, cash transfers can be a good option for youth, especially if they don't have the habit of saving. Yeah, I did a paper. It's available on the World Bank website, by the way, in the policy working paper here, or you can just Google Fox and Call, and I think it's referenced in your stuff, where I talk about the evidence for cash transfers. And there's a lot of evidence for cash transfers on this point. But I would say fix the financial rules. Okay, so Susanna, as you probably know, I'm not the world's expert on firm entry and firm exit and labor intensive and all of that. I did summarize in my paper the evidence that I have on the demand side for existing firms. I think the area that I would give a shout out, and there's a lot of evidence on finance, especially for larger firms. You know, larger firms are more likely to stay in business. The romance of small enterprise really eventually needs to end, because small enterprises tend to fail regardless of productivity. They just fail more often for a lot of reasons that are too complicated for me to explain here. Whereas larger firms tend to hire more workers, and they tend to stay in business longer. Having said that, I think we have really underestimated the role of management. You know, I used to work at the World Bank. I was just in Myanmar working with the USAID economists, trying to diagnose the problems with employment in the economy. Everybody goes to these World Bank surveys, and they go to the business environment surveys, which refer to the law, not people's behavior. And then they go to the enterprise surveys, where they ask the managers, what would it take for you to expand employment? What are your constraints? Now, I've never seen a manager say, it's me. But Von Reenen and Bloom and a bunch of guys have done quite a bit of work that suggests it is them. It is management. Management is a real deficit. Human resource management, financial management, sales management. And when they give some specific types of management help that help firm expand sales, they expand employment. So again, I think it's an area where we need a different type of research, because the existing tools we're using are maybe like looking for the key under the lamppost when it's really over there, but we don't have the light on to look for it. So I'm seeing the stop sign. I'd better stop.
Stop. Thank you so much, Luis. Thank you, everyone. And we're going to transition to the last but not least final session with Patricia.
Thank you, everyone. This session also has an interesting name. It's A Future of Decent Work for the Most Deprived, Zombie Apocalypse or Superhero Adventure. So I will leave it to your imagination what that could possibly mean. But what I'd like to do first is to review what is the purpose of this session given that title, right? I want to give you a little context. So increasing evidence, as has already been referred to today, has amply documented how skills are important for young people to get work. We're not saying that it's the only thing they need, but just over the last 5 years, there's been more and more research about how important what's social emotional, non-cognitive, soft skills, what we call transferable life skills that Save the Children are, for youth, especially for deprived youth. The other thing to keep in mind is how quickly the workplace is changing. So we actually would like to address both of these issues in this session. It's really around how can we make sure that the young people we work with have these skills to constantly adapt to a constantly changing workplace. And the workplace is changing not just because of the digital revolution, but there are many other factors that are changing the workplace, especially, for example, the increasing informality of many jobs that our young people are getting. So what we like to do in this session is talk about, we're not going to dwell on what skills are important, even though that will come up as a topic, but we really do want to get into how young people build these skills. You'll see that there really isn't that much evidence about how young people can build these skills, except the World Bank has been doing some really interesting stuff, and so that is what we'll present today. So I've asked representatives from the private sector and from the World Bank to speak about these topics. First, we'll start with some market research on the future of work, and then we will go into a review of some impact evaluations of what skills were needed and how they could be built most effectively today. Not in the future, but today, actually in an African context. So I'd like to invite the two speakers today to come up to the dais, if you don't mind. We have Heidi Strawson, the director of Accenture's Global Giving Program, who you met earlier. She opened the event. And then we also have Julia Vallon, who is an economist at the World Bank. She's with the Gender Innovation Lab in the Africa region. And I would like to point out to everybody that research briefs on every single session you've heard today are in your folder, so you can actually read about all the research that informed our choice of the topic that we talked about today. And then also there are resource tables for the partner organizations outside, and you can find additional research, the actual studies themselves, on the tables, and I encourage you to pick up as many as you want. So regarding the session today, after the presentations, you're actually going to have 20 minutes to ask questions. And we encourage you to ask for the mic. You can also write your questions down. And as Sylvia said, the more questions we get, the better, because that's going to inform what we put into the white paper based on the event today. And again, if you take the mic, please identify yourself and your organization. Keep your comments brief and to be respectful of other people. And with that, I would really like to invite Heidi Strawson of Accenture to come and talk to us about the future.
Thanks, Patricia. I'm not sure if I'm in charge of the zombie bit or the superhero bit. Maybe a little bit of both. Thank you very much. So the good news is we're nearly at the end of the morning session, and furthermore, I'm not an academic. I'm not going to be sharing with you, more's the pity, any economic models or in-depth graphs. In fact, my role here really is to warm you up for the work that Julia's going to be presenting. Patricia referred to some market research that Accenture has undertaken. And whilst I wouldn't want to be preaching to the converted and telling you all things you already know, it is useful, we believe, to just frame the context a little bit around some of the forces that are shaping and redefining the future of work. We will touch on, just very briefly, the skills and skills families that we believe are going to be really important. And more importantly, how can those skills be developed and designed into programs? And that's really where I think the meat of the conversation will probably be. As a self-serving exercise, we know as an employer what we're looking for in terms of our own future of work. We're canvassing and processing over 1 million CVs or resume applicants every year, and that's globally. We're just currently over 400,000 people. And we're interested in attracting and retaining a certain profile of person that's going to allow us to engage and deliver our business for our clients in years to come. But beyond that, as a partner of organizations like Save the Children and others who are engaged in this space, we have a very keen and vested interest in provoking the discussion about what that looks like more broadly beyond the demographic that we're looking to attract. So we conducted this market research where we interviewed a whole host of experts working across this space. Some of you may even be in this room, so thank you very much. We also looked and analyzed detailed frameworks, skills building frameworks, over 25 of those. We looked at 1,000 skilling interventions. We also assessed 130 million job postings. Now, full disclosure, the bias towards this is in more developed markets. This was spread over 30 countries. It won't touch on some of the challenges that Julia and the others have been referring to earlier, but we do believe that this throws up a few interesting trends and hopefully provokes some of the questions into where this is heading. So, wrong way. Okay, we called this New Skills Now. And to state the obvious, obviously, technology is transforming how we live and work, and this presents both opportunity and disruption. We know, I mean, there are various statistics out there, so these are really just indicators, but 14% of all jobs may be restructured entirely. A further 32% could face significant change. So some jobs lost, some jobs created, where, for whom? What does this mean? I think we would all make assumptions, given the technology component here, of the increased requirement for digitally relevant skills. Digitally intensive middle skill jobs are growing 2.5 times faster than traditional analog counterparts. But what other skills are required and who needs these jobs? So these are some of the things that we wanted to explore. Sorry, keep doing that. And we see that unlike prior technological shifts, the pace of change today is impacting the entire global workforce. I mean, of that we can feel relatively sure, even though the impact on certain labor markets is yet to be fully appreciated and determined. But what we believe will be relevant is that some people are going to be disproportionately affected, and it's likely to be those who are already facing hardship. So for sure, if by lack of awareness, agility, or the means to navigate the changes ahead, you will be perhaps facing a double disadvantage, and this will impact those who are already vulnerable and marginalized today. So when we looked at what some of the features are of the context for skilling and reskilling looking ahead, we see the following defining features. And again, I wouldn't want to preach to the converted here, but I think given the importance of technology and despite that focus and need for digital skills, it is the human skills that will be most critical to the success of those in terms of the future of work. And working with intelligent technology actually puts a premium on those distinctive human skills. So we're talking about complex reasoning, creativity, socio and emotional intelligence. So we sort of look towards the right of this spectrum. We are anticipating gig economy type scenarios and a need for people to be, if you like, more nimble. And to a point that was made just now, this doesn't just apply to young people. This applies to all people. We're very interested in the disruption of jobs and the impact of automation for those already in less complex roles. Let's say the parents of the young people. It's beyond the scope of today's discussions, but these skills are relevant to those needing to reskill and position themselves for success in work, as well as those applying for their first job. So when we look at this research, which I'm prompted, I can only do very, very briefly, to unlock these labor opportunities and prepare workers to thrive, we need to look at the skills that they need, not just in the future, but actually now. We have come up with a skills family framework. We believe that these are the skills that young people entering the workforce need holistically to adapt and remain relevant. We could use different terms. I'm sure you've seen many. But the linchpin to all of this, and perhaps a surprise to some of my colleagues who would be predisposed to thinking about technology skills and STEM as being a key linchpin to skills programs going forward, is this idea of growth mindset. What do you need to secure and retain work in a world of uncertainty will depend, we believe, not just about getting a job, but thriving and positioning yourself for the next job. In fact, the whole concept of job will become obsolete. So those people who are adaptive, who can take initiative, who can commit themselves to continuous learning, those are the ones that will be best positioned to thrive. But the snag being that when we looked across the various skills frameworks that exist, these are the least represented aspects of existing programs today, which pushes and provokes us to consider, looking at some of the partners that we have, who is doing this? What does it look like? And very briefly moving on, I think if I come to the slide, it's not here, okay. This one. This is our evidence to action slide, I think. These are the things that we are looking for in terms of the sorts of programs that we want to invest in and explore. This isn't about being academic for the whole, we're not talking about sort of 4-year research programs here with peer-reviewed evidence, fascinating and important though that is. I think we're looking to deploy more nimble, iterative ways of working so that we can identify things that might just work. And picking up on one of the remarks made earlier, learning from the innovation agenda where you have startups and smaller niche offerings, what can we quickly learn and deploy from that we could augment into larger programs for skilling and replication? We don't have all the answers, but at least we're homing in on some of the important questions. And I think, Patricia, before I get another notification from the front here, it's on that point that I'll hand over to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks, Patricia. I'm really happy to be here today to speak about skills, and in particular, how social-emotional skills can be taught within business skills trainings. So we know that traditional business trainings don't really work very well in developing countries. There's a lot of evidence on that. But there's also more and more recent evidence that when you incorporate a psychological component to a business training curriculum, there are actually positive impacts. Also, social-emotional skills can be learned, and they can be learned as adults in the context of a training program. And I think that building on what Heidi was just talking about, how the growth mindset is so important, but she was talking about more developing countries and formal labor markets, but actually there's a whole lot that we can learn from informal markets, self-employment in developing countries on how to build that growth mindset that can, I think, be really useful and transferable to the kinds of more formal markets, developed economies that Heidi was referring to. So I think these things complement each other really nicely. I have here on this slide which social-emotional skills. This is because I think that we don't really know enough yet on which social-emotional skill we should focus on, which ones matter really for labor market outcomes, especially in developing countries. I think that's a really important research agenda, but I'm not going to talk about this now. I'm going to talk about how to deliver these skills, more the delivery mechanism. So for that, as other researchers before me this morning have done, I'm going to talk about a few different studies. The objective here is not a comprehensive review of all socio-emotional skills research in developing countries. It's more a few studies from which we can hopefully learn something and gain some food for thought, maybe especially for the discussions this afternoon. 3 of these studies were actually conducted by the team that I work for, the Africa Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank, and the one study from India is not a Gender Innovation Lab study. So let me jump into the first study, which is looking at the impact of a personal initiative training in Togo. So personal initiative training is a business training that incorporates psychological components in the curriculum and emphasizes elements such as goal setting, planning and implementation, being self-starting, defining goals, and overcoming obstacles. It comes from the business psychology theory, and that training was compared to a more standard business training, which teaches skills that are more narrowly linked to management, accounting, sales, marketing, etc. So women and men entrepreneurs were in the study and either were assigned the personal initiative training or the standard business training. The PI training, personal initiative, worked really well, and it worked really well in particular for women whose profits increased by 40% as compared to 5% for those who had the standard business training. So there are some business trainings that do work, and maybe they work when they actually try to teach the right set of skills. And the right set of skills may just be this psychological component or the growth mindset. Moving on to a study in Ethiopia. So this study looks at the impact of several different business trainings. The first one that was run by the Digital Opportunity Trust, which is a social enterprise. That was an entrepreneurship training program that incorporated some psychological aspects. And then the other part of this study compared the personal initiative training done in Ethiopia to also a more standard business training. So the DOT training had components, had taught some self-confidence and entrepreneurial mindset. The beneficiaries were all women entrepreneurs in Mekele, and it was a classroom-based training. So this particular training had positive impacts on the beneficiaries' profits. Their profits were 30% higher. Also, their self-efficacy, personal initiative, and locus of control improved. But there were no changes in business practices or knowledge. So here we think these results suggest that the important component of a successful business training is changing the psychological outcomes, not actually the business practices, which confirms a lot of previous findings from reviews of business trainings around the world, which show that they do change business practices, but these don't translate into changes in business profits. Now, if we change psychological outcomes, we might be able to change profits and improve these important outcomes. Second part of that study compared the PI training to a more standard training. So the PI, again, focuses on this entrepreneurial mindset. It's the same curriculum as the one that was used in Togo. And it was compared to the BSED training, which is a more standard business training that still has some focus on a creative mindset. It's not completely devoid of psychological component. These were both classroom-based trainings, and they were delivered in 6 TVET colleges in Addis. So we don't see any impacts on profits of either of these 2 trainings, but we also don't see any impacts on psychological outcomes, or business practices. So this confirms that the psychological aspect is probably the missing link. So what can we learn in terms of delivery mechanisms from these studies? Why did the PI training work in Togo and didn't work in Ethiopia, but the DOT training worked? So we learn really that the delivery mechanism really matters. The curriculum is important, but how it's delivered is really important. We're not actually comparing this like for like when we're comparing the PI training in Togo to the PI training in Ethiopia. In Togo, we're comparing a training that was basically privately delivered, whereas in Ethiopia, it was delivered in TVET colleges, which are government institutions at a really large scale and a pretty low cost, because adding an additional training in an already existing government-run training center is much less costly. But it has some constraints. It involves fixed schedules, not as flexible and adapted to an existing entrepreneur's time constraints. The PI training in Togo was 3 days a week over a longer time period, whereas in the TVET colleges, they had to go to training every single day for several weeks. There was also a take-up problem in Ethiopia. The take-up was pretty low. It was between 40 and 50%. Why was it so low? Potentially because of this scheduling problem, also potentially because TVET colleges are not that attractive. They're not necessarily seen as very high-quality training facilities. And actually, if we look at targeting, we do see that this training in Ethiopia attracted the lower performers, so entrepreneurs who were already lower performing, not the highest performers. So it may be that to increase take-up and increase the quality, or the, I don't want to say the quality of people, but to increase the, how can I say that? The take-up of higher performers, we may need to change some of the delivery mechanisms, maybe have more individual coaching, or adapt the scheduling so that there's way more flexibility. Another really, thank you, another really important aspect is the trainer. We do find in the PI and BSCD study that those trainees whose trainer was a woman and had previously owned a business did have positive impacts on their psychological outcomes. So it seems like a well-fit match between the trainers and the trainees is really important. But unfortunately, only about 30% of the trainers fit that particular profile. So I have about 1 minute left, and I'm going to go over 1 more minute maybe, because Patricia authorized me. Just to mention 2 other studies. Why these studies? Because one of them is delivering social-emotional skills training in a factory with wage workers, and the other one will be a business and life skills training for adolescent girls in Liberia. So very different targets, covering the range from self-employment to wage employment. So this study by Advariu shows that social-emotional skills training delivered to female garment workers in factories in India worked to improve their psychological outcomes, non-cognitive skills, also improved their productivity. It had positive impacts on other workers in the firm, so positive spillovers, and overall the firm itself really benefited from training, from giving these transferable skills to its own workers, and that's a really important finding, I think. coming back to the African continent, Liberia, a study on adolescent girls receiving business skills training and life skills training. And the training had strong impacts on economic outcomes, such as employment, but also boosted their self-confidence and other empowerment measures. And one really important thing here in terms of thinking about delivery mechanisms is how this training had some really key, what we call girl-friendly design elements. The scheduling was adapted, the location was close to where they lived and was especially secure. Providers provided childcare services for those adolescents who had children. They were on performance-based contracts that depended on placing the girls in a job and high-quality monitoring. So I think all of these design elements may explain and help understand why this particular program worked when a lot of these programs actually don't work. So to wrap up, what do we take away from all of these different studies? Social emotional skills can be built within the context of training programs across a variety of settings, but we really need to take into account what the delivery mechanism is, who's the target, what are the needs and the constraints of the targeted population. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Can you hear me? Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Heidi. That was really fantastic. It was worth the extra minute. Very clear conclusions to several studies, not just one. And it's another example of how we can build an evidence base, right? This is your opportunity, audience, to ask some questions around skills building. And I welcome you to come to the mic if you'd like. One thing I would like to do first, though, is to turn it back on you, because I want to ask the audience questions. So it doesn't happen that often, but I have 4 questions I want to ask the audience. So I want you to take the mic and answer me and answer us. Also, be thinking about questions that you'd like to ask the panel, the presenters here, and write them down. But first, I want to ask you 4 questions. I'm going to start with the first one. How can you imagine using these findings to improve your own programs? Does this give you any ideas? What you're going to do differently when you go back to the office tomorrow? Any ideas? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. I'll tell you what the second question is going to be. What constraints would you face in using these findings or findings like these? Is there something inside your organization that's going to make it impossible for you to incorporate social emotional skills into a training program, or you don't work with the right age group, or you don't work in the right location, or the trainers won't show up to the TOTs or something? What constraints would you face in using findings like these to improve your programs? Anyone have any ideas of how you can use findings like these in your own programs?
Hi, can you hear me? Tasmia Rahman, Head of Skills Program from Bangladesh, looking after the Bangladesh portfolio. I think a very important message from this particular presentation is the trainer and the curricula that comes into the soft skills component. Because I think often we focus a lot on the material, but not really on the person. So I think that's a very important element, I think. So would definitely start an evaluation to see how this works. And a question that I have, I think, is for Julia. Yeah, no. Heidi, right, Heidi. I'm curious to know if the future of, when you look at the future of skills, does care economy come at all? Because I think we are increasingly looking at, developing countries like Bangladesh, where we see as more and more women come into the workspace, the care component is kind of not taken care of. People don't understand it, and then there's a disruption, if you will, because increasingly the families think that women will take this on, and it doesn't happen. So what do we do? So I'm curious to know if you look at that at all in the market study of future of skills.
Thank you very much. I think we had another question right here, or a comment on how you'd use the findings in your own program. Right here, please. Thank you.
Thank you, both of the presenters. And we really learned many things from both presentations. Just I would like to share one of my learnings from the presentations, particularly Julia. So what you have mentioned, that psychosocial outcomes, how we can integrate the psychosocial component into our technical and vocational education programs. So these learnings I would like to take from your presentation, and I would also utilize in our program. And my also another question to you, Julia, what is the difference between the psychosocial outcomes and the life skills outcomes? So what do you feel, are there any difference between these two outcomes? Between psychosocial and the life skills training outcomes. Thank you.
We can take one more comment and question. Anything? No? Okay, why don't we had two questions. Do you want to address them?
Sure, thank you. This will be a fairly swift response from me in answer to your question about whether in our assessment of the future of work skills, the disruptive element of a care economy is something that we've looked at or that arose. I am not aware that it did in the sort of macro context of our research. That's not to say that at Accenture we don't have a point of view on that. That informs our own inclusion and diversity and how we can attract and retain people that have obligations to family and others that need to be adjusted for and adapted and anticipated and supported by their employer. I mean, I would say that as hopefully a progressive global representative of a progressive global employer. I'm no expert on how that looks in the kind of macro context. I wonder if there's anyone in the room that has a point of view on that. It wouldn't be me.
Do you want to try the next question?
Thanks for the question. I don't think there is a difference really between psychosocial outcomes and life skill outcomes. I think we have a bit of a vocabulary mashup at the moment, which I'm also guilty of, absolutely. So we use social-emotional skills in my team, but we've used life skills for a really long time and non-cognitive skills. So even among my team, we kind of have these different words. And in terms of actual outcomes, we have used psychosocial, psychological, life skills, non-cognitive, all of these kind of meaning the same thing. If a psychologist was here, they would probably like go nuts hearing me say that. And we probably have some efforts ahead of us to clarify all of these. I am really happy to hear that you would think of incorporating some of these psychosocial aspects to a TVET program. And also coming back to what the other person who spoke just before said about the trainer, I think it's really important to like consider these things together, because a trainer who doesn't actually have these skills themselves can't really teach them. So it has to go a little bit, we have to back up a little bit, find trainers who have these skills, or in like TVET programs, or think of having maybe more role model interventions with, I don't know, successful entrepreneurs who come and sort of try to teach these skills. I think there's a lot to learn on that at the moment.
Thank you. We have a question over here, or a comment as well. And then if anyone has the answer to the care economy question, we'd love to hear it too. And please identify yourself. Sure. Thank you.
Thanks. Mike McCabe from USAID. Thank you again for your presentations. I guess based on your two questions, the two things that jump out, how can it help inform us from a donor side? And as we look at kind of this new administration, and now a lot of our missions are starting their new country strategies. And so this sort of evidence and an evidence agenda really can help us inform the roadmap that we're working on within USAID to inform our missions as they design new programs, because without this detail of evidence, we might not be narrowing in the way we need to on the design. And a lot of our missions will be looking at issues of economic growth and employment and youth employment. So that's where it's extremely helpful, and it's great to listen to your evidence on social-emotional skills and psychosocial. Through the Youth Power mechanism, we've been doing a lot of research on which of the soft skills have the greatest outcome predictability on workforce versus violence prevention versus versus sexual reproductive health. And then on the constraints, one of the challenges I've been thinking about all morning is this is important, but how do we design with scale in mind from the start? It seems a lot, we've been talking about how do we get innovation going, how do we think about these interventions and these packages, but when we're thinking about a Uganda, which is doubling its population in the next 22 years, if we don't design, thinking about what are the core components that are cost effective to go to scale, we really could be designing programs that really will only be reaching the 4 or 10 or 20,000 versus the 4 million or 10 million. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we have a few more questions here. A note. Oh, it's a note. Yes, excellent. Okay. I want to let you know that we want to stay in touch and we want to continue this conversation, and that could take many different forms. So we welcome your ideas about how we can continue this conversation. That's the first point. The second point is we're going to send out this is an event about evidence, right? So of course we're going to send you a survey so we can hear what you thought about the event, but also we're going to include in there your suggestions about research questions that we should prioritize over the next 5 years, ways we can all continue to collaborate, and then obviously how you want to continue the discussion. So I did want to let you all know that. Are there any other points that you want to bring up right now? Otherwise, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. Bonnie, do you want to take the mic? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Politz. I'm a youth and community strategy consultant. And a lot of this has been focused on the young people, the workers, the learners themselves. And a question I have is about the systems they exist in these businesses or private sector or wherever they are. The intentionality of having, how are the people, supervisors, others who work with young people or people who have come through these trainings, how are the systems getting prepared, and the kinds of evaluation systems even of these workers? How is all of that going to be a part of this, and not just focus on what the young people or the young workers have to do? They're coming into places and they're coming to establish systems, and are there efforts to really focus on that?
Thank you so much. So are you suggesting that should be a research question that we work on? Great, thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. If you had to advise Accenture on how to implement the recommendations in New Skills Now, what would you recommend based on the research that we heard today? Okay? And then, my final question, and Bonnie already started us on it, is what do you still feel you need to know to design programs that build youth skills effectively? So basically, think of one research question you think we need to answer about skills building over the next 5 years in order for you to be effective in your jobs and to see your programs be effective. I'll give you a few seconds to think about that one too.
Do we have to fund the best suggestion? Is that what's going on here? Is it maybe like crowdsourcing our next research agenda? Oh, just checking. Great, thanks for that clarification.
Hi, I'm Audrey Williams-Lee with Hyatt Hotels Corporation, and I don't have an exact answer to your questions, but to Bonnie's question around what happens when you're hiring youth, we've been doing quite a bit of focus on that area lately, and we're finding that the infrastructure you need to have in your organization to help your supervisors get ready to understand how to work with populations who may come from different backgrounds, but also the mentoring and support that's needed for retention when you first hire the employees is really important. So we're doing quite a bit of work around working with Grads of Life. We're doing playbooks for our supervisors, for our community-based organizations, our nonprofit partners around how to work with us and kind of what's needed, you know, to make everything work together. So we're still in the early stages, but understanding what it's going to take to make us successful is something we're spending a lot of time on.
Thank you. That's great, great model. And we had, you have your mic? Thanks. We have another comment over here.
So, in answer to your question, one of the frustrations I, as a researcher and someone trying to advise people doing programs, have is that in this area, measurement is not standardized, and very often programs don't measure baseline and then changes. You know, I'm not a psychologist, but it looks to me like the psychologists have spent a lot of time on this, on these big 5 personality traits, and I get a little frustrated when we as economists kind of reject all that knowledge and say we have to invent our own, you know, measures and our own studies and whatever. But I just think if we could, 1, start to agree on at least some key dimensions, 2, start to use some standardized measurement skill. 3, do a baseline and an outcome to see if anything actually changed. In other words, if the intermediate outcome was realized, not just the final outcome. I think it could help us a lot.
Thank you for that recommendation. I do want to put a plug in for Save the Children's own research, where we, based on the Big 5 and also based on the meta-analysis that USAID funded, that Child Trends did, we created a curriculum based on what we call the 5 buckets of important cognitive and non-cognitive skills. We now call them transferable life skills. And we then created a measurement tool that's psychometrically validated and reliable, and it's easy to use. It's called the Employability Assessment Tool, or EA tool. And we've actually found in the Philippines and Indonesia that young people who do improve their skills based on this measurement tool, those skills are actually associated with their employment outcomes. So we're actually seeing that the young people who have more skills are more likely to get jobs and get jobs faster. The problem is that we're not sure exactly which of the skills are most important to them getting the jobs. And we don't actually know what delivery mechanism is best. And we don't know if we're giving them enough training or not enough training, you know, too much training. So for example, maybe we only have to give them half as much training as we give them. And it would cost much less, and then we could reach more. But we don't know that yet, and we need to do a lot more research and do experiments around dosage and sequencing and timing and location and the type of trainer. So we had one more. We had 2 hands over here, and let's make that our last comments and questions, okay?
One in the back here.
Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is Holly Habimana. I work with the Aquila Foundation, a college for women in East Africa. And in answer to your question number 3, I would say that to an extent, the implementation on the recommendations and the new skills now has to be a multifaceted approach. It's not just one or the other. It's not just soft skills, and it's not just tech skills, and it's not just, you know, higher order thinking and computer literacy and all of those things. I think taking a multifaceted approach, as I'm sure all of us in this room already know, would be highly beneficial. But in addition to that, taking a look at the ripple benefit, the ripple effects that benefit the community, that benefit the student, the person, and what that both direct beneficiary and indirect beneficiaries look like, and how we can measure that more effectively. I think that's something that maybe Accenture and some of the other funders in this room, donors in this room, can really focus on in kind of moving forward and what that looks like. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a few more. 2 more? Yep.
Hi, thanks for a great and very inspirational morning. I'm going to tackle question 4. Sorry, Heidi. So what do we still feel we need to know? I'm going to make 2 quick points. One is I think we can also learn from what doesn't work, not to overshadow the brilliance and the inspirational findings that we've had this morning, but there's a lot of things that don't work, and that's equally important evidence. And again, not to overshadow the rigor and excellence of what we've learned through the studies this morning, I feel that there's a danger that we overshadow the importance of formative research. So we take these findings and we go, we've learnt this is what we need to do here, here, and here. And partly it's due to the condensed nature of the morning, but I feel like we've lost a sense of context of the environments in which young people are living and how that differs in different places. And that's absolutely important for people that are wanting to imitate, even if not innovate. And going back to what Asif Salih said this morning, it's no accident that BRAC has succeeded so well in scale-up and innovation. They've grounded every single aspect of their program in formative research, in understanding the communities and countries in which they work in. And I don't think we can forget that just by focusing on the evidence of outcomes itself. Thanks. Did I introduce myself? No, I don't think I did. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm Nicola Banks from the University of Manchester.
Hi, I'm Mika Polanco at USAID. Excuse me, I'm also going to answer question 4. One body of evidence that I don't see tapped enough that I'd really love to see more is what are youth and the communities that they're embedded in saying that they need. What are youth and the communities, their families and the communities that they're embedded in say that they'd like to see as an outcome. And so that's a piece of evidence that I think doesn't exist as robustly as other that I'd like to see built up and also tapped.
Thank you so much. We are at time. So if you still have burning questions, I encourage you to write them on the stickies and leave them on the table. We would really want to thank you. I want to thank Julia and Heidi so much for amazing presentations and wonderful work. Please keep up the work. And then we're going to move to close the day now. So what I'd like to do is invite the Save the Children and BRAC people, JPAL, and 3IE people to come up. I want to show you what collaboration looks like. So if you want to come up to the front. Thank you so much. Thank you. You can stay up here too if you want to be part of the collaboration. So do we have more people? I want to show how many people. I just want to say thank you so much for pulling this together. Everyone played amazing roles in this. Before you go, I want to encourage you to go out to the resource tables, take advantage of all the amazing research that's out there. And then also there is a step and repeat with wonderful youth faces right out the front. Please go and take photographs of yourself in front of these young people that we've served. I'm very sorry that young people are not here today, and I really hope that next time we're going to have a lot of young people in the room, okay? And I also want to say let's keep this discussion going. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to use better evidence so that we can be really cost efficient and continue to serve more young people and scale up. I invite, I don't know if any of you guys want to say anything, but I just want to thank BRAC, JPAL, 3IE, and the National Press Club for making this really a wonderful event. So thank you very much. And I do want to say that Accenture and Save the Children continue to work together. We're hoping to reach 200,000 young people by 2020. And that's, again, just tip of the iceberg. But Accenture has many, many partners. And again, I want to reiterate that by 2020, they will have reached 3 million young people. So I want to give a big round of applause to Accenture as well. So this adjourns the day, and I want to thank the live stream audience for joining us as well. And again, please feel free to take some research that's on the tables and have your photograph taken in front of the step and repeat. You can exit through this door or that door. Okay, thank you so much.